Okay, this video will be for the French seam. Again, we'll be using our basic rectangle, making sure that when you cut it out, your grain line is going parallel to the selvage of your fabric. And you'll need 2 of those so that you can have 2 to stitch together. Straight edges for the 2 edges that will get stitched together, pinking shears for the other edges so that they don't ravel in your notebook. This seam is really good for lightweight fabrics, chiffon, anything that is sheer, because it will create a tube on the inside of your seam that hides all of your seam allowances. It looks really professional, and when it's sheer and you're able to see through the garment, it makes everything look very clean and neat. It's also one of the exceptions to the rule. Most seams are 1/2 inch standard in the industry. This one, we are actually going to start with a 1/4 inch. Total, we will take up a 1/2 inch by the end of it, but we'll do 1/4 inch stitches at a time. This one also starts wrong sides together versus right sides. Most seams start right sides together. This one will start wrong sides together, so again, those non-printed sides should be what's touching each other. I'm going to pin perpendicular to my seam so that I can take those pins out easily and get my foot as close to them as possible before having to remove them. Okay, and then I'm going to line up my fabric with that 1/4 inch etching on my machine plate. So I should still be able to see the 1/4 inch marking. Meaning that my fabric is in line with the correct line measurement, but right next to it, it physically says a 1/4 inch, and that's the part that I should still be able to see. Starting from the very edge, back stitch, just watching the edge of my fabric to stay in line with that 1/4 inch marking. And taking off my excess thread. Okay, so that's what we're looking like to begin with. Over at our ironing board, the first thing we always want to do is bust open our seam. So open that up, pull on it to make sure that it's nice and flat on that underside. Open your seam allowances and separate them. And then I'm going to use my press cloth to protect it and press those seams open. Next thing we need to do for a French seam is we're going to trim both of our seam allowances down to 1/8 of an inch. We started with a 1/4 and now we're going to 1/8, so that should be in half essentially. So each side I'm just cutting through that one seam allowance, not through all of my layers, and I'm going to cut it in half down to 1/8 of an inch. Okay, that's one side, and then I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. So this is what we're looking like at the moment. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is, if these little seam allowances were the pages of my book, I'm going to close my book so those seam allowances are inside. That seam that we stitched on the first step, we want that right on the folded edge. So I'm going to fold on that edge with my 2 rectangles right sides together and press a crease into that edge. keeping that seam right on the folded edge. We need to be very accurate. Okay. Now, I'm going to go back to my sewing machine and stitch another 1/4 inch seam using that folded edge that we just created as my new reference point. Okay, so now we've got our sample with that folded edge right on the seam. Again, that's our new reference point, so I'm going to line that folded edge up with the 1/4 inch marking on my machine and stitch a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. So that's what we're looking like. Once I open this up, you'll see from the outside it looks like a regular seam. From the inside, we've got this tube that is encasing all of our raw edges. Last step is to go back and press this, and then we'll be done. When we press a French seam, we are not able to bust open the seam allowances because we've now sewn them all together into this tube. So we need to lay out our pattern, pull it apart to get that flat front, and then this tube is going to get pressed to one side. If I had a seam running down the center front or center back of my body, I would press it towards the wearer's right. So if you're wearing the garment, it should be on your right-hand side. Or if it's down a, let's say, shoulder seam, some side of the body, it will need to get pressed towards the back of the body. So in your sample, you're going to press it towards the right since we don't have a reference of a front and a back. Press that tube over to the right-hand side. And this one, it's very easy to get that crease on the underside that we don't want because you've only got one tube and you're pressing it all towards one side. So all of the tension is kind of pulling the fabric towards one side. So I like to press it from the back and the front. I do the back first to get it to stay over to the right. And then from the front, you can see I've got this little pleat here that's starting to form, because all of my fabric is getting pulled over to one side. So I don't want that. I'm going to pull it apart. This part I may have to do away with the press cloth so that I can pull it and press at the same time. Pull it apart and press it at the same time so that I get rid of that crease on the front. Just make sure if you abandon your press cloth for a moment that your iron is clean. You don't want to use a brown gunky iron and get that gunk, or white powder if it has a powder from the water that you're using. That's usually just dissolved minerals. But both of those can ruin the front of your fabric. So now I've gotten rid of that pleat, completely flat on the front, and from the back I've got my tube going over to the wearer's right. So if this was on my body with the non-printed side touching my body, the tube would be over to my right-hand side.